In the second week of March, the sale of paper maps, travel guides, pagers, and walkie-talkies soared in Moscow. These spikes didn't reflect a sudden wartime camping boom, but rather the demand for analog maps and communication devices is evidence that many Muscovites' internet isn't working amidst Russia's widespread blackouts. Now, Russia says that these blackouts are a defensive measure against Ukrainian drones, but evidence points to a more concerted effort by the Kremlin to reshape the country's internet into something more resembling China's so-called Great Firewall. Having seen the fall of multiple significant allies in the last year, a coup is more terrifying to Putin than ever. This is the time for his regime to close all the loops and destroy all of the pathways. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and this week we're going to unpack the culmination of years of work by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin's regime to seize full control over Russian citizens' internet access. The internet has always been a tricky tool for dictators. On the one hand, it's a tool for mass communication that can take propaganda and surveillance to an entirely new level. Think of the fictional television screens in George Orwell's 1984. You have a state-owned platform for broadcasting an endless stream of propaganda that's always on, never turned off, with an invisible eye surveilling citizens through their screens whenever desired. You can see how these capabilities would serve an authoritarian regime. But on the other hand, when used freely, the internet gives users a window to the wider world, and a means to talk and organize amongst themselves. So you can see how that's problematic for a dictator trying to push a single ideology and silence dissenters. Now, when we look at states that are labeled authoritarian or totalitarian by modern standards, we see a spectrum of ways that this plays out. In North Korea, for example, citizens only have access to an intranet. If you go to a public library in Pyongyang and use a computer there, you'll only be able to access North Korean websites, which are obviously approved by the state. In China, which is less isolated than North Korea but still notorious for censorship and surveillance, Facebook and other major Western websites are banned, but the internet is still an internet, not an intranet. And that brings us to today's patient, Russia. The current blackouts sweeping Russia are part of, and perhaps are even the culmination of, a multi-decades-long effort by the Kremlin to fully control the internet in Russia. The internet as we know it was developed in 1983. 11 years later, in 1994, the first .ru website domain was registered. This marked the birth of the Russian-language internet, or, as it was called by the late 90s, RuNet. RuNet has long existed in parallel to the .com internet. While Westerners use Google, Facebook, and Amazon, Russians have similar platforms called Yandex, Vkontakte, and Wildberries, all of which have pretty similar user experiences as Western websites, but are, number one, in the Russian language, and number two, created in Russia with these .ru domains. The Kremlin has long expressed interest in making RuNet fully sovereign from the rest of the internet, with infrastructure that can stand on its own, even cut off from the rest of the world. And they are now closer to that goal than ever. In the 2010s, the Kremlin began introducing laws framed around combating extremism and hate speech. Now that might sound reasonable on the surface, but by the Kremlin's standards, extremism could be defined as showing a gay couple in a movie, or writing a Facebook status saying that Crimea is Ukraine. These anti-extremism laws made it a lot easier for the Russian state to arrest people for their online activity, and to label independent media and other watchdogs as foreign agents, which are subject to prosecution for online activities perceived to go against the Kremlin. It also paved the way for Russia to follow China's lead in blocking Western sites. VPNs can be somewhat effective in circumventing blocks, but governments are increasingly tightening controls and making them harder to bypass. By 2019, Russia was introducing laws requiring internet providers to install equipment to filter internet traffic through a central system. Around this time, the foreign agents label was being applied to more and more institutions and individuals, in what we can now see was the lead-up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And obviously, the war threw everything into overdrive, and the Kremlin got a whole lot less subtle about what they were blocking and why. If before there were dry arguments about threats of extremism, now the explanation is that sites are blocked because they are Western and threaten Russian values. A few years ago, it wasn't uncommon at all for Russians to use both Russian and Western social media like Facebook and Instagram, but now these sites are fully banned and can only be accessed with a VPN. YouTube has been slowed so much that it's functionally useless in Russia. VPN companies themselves are increasingly blocked or otherwise forced off the Russian market. Like I said earlier, the internet can be both an information-sharing tool and a platform for social movements to organize without participants being geographically close to each other. Totalitarian states really can't afford for their citizens to have secure, untraceable means of freely contacting each other. So messaging apps have also faced the same pressure in Russia as broadcasting apps. Whether it's Western-made platforms like WhatsApp and Signal, or ones like Telegram that were made by Russian tech companies, the Kremlin does not want people to have access to end-to-end encryption. So now, they're offering up a new messaging platform to replace all the others. It's called Max, and, predictably, it runs everything through the Kremlin system, and removes the surveillance-preventing features of other apps. I'm joined by my colleague Oleg Sukhov to speak a little bit more about the context and precedent for this increased censorship. How early did the idea of a separate, sovereign Russian internet appear?
Well, it's hard to identify a precise period. Russia has been restricting media, and destroying independent media since, Putin came to power in 1999. There have been internet restrictions all the time since he came to power. And, some hardcore, Russian officials and, propagandists probably advocated this idea from the very beginning. But initially, there was nothing like the Chinese system of censorship or even the Iranian one. So, and I think that this process really accelerated before the full-scale invasion and especially during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
So would you say that kind of full control over it has always been Putin's goal? Do you think he's taking inspiration from China's Great Firewall? Is that kind of his ultimate goal that he's been working towards?
Yeah, obviously Putin wants to control the entire internet, and I think they admire the Chinese censorship system and also the Iranian censorship system. I think especially during the recent protests in Iran and the war in Iran, they took inspiration from Iran because the almost total internet shutdown in Iran, actually 2 shutdowns were successful in terms of suppressing dissent. So I think Russia was probably inspired by it.
If you asked me a few months ago about the state of Russia's internet censorship, I would have said that they were on a bad path and the prognosis was grim. Internet blackouts began there in earnest last May, and Russia was already leading the world in total hours of internet outages by the end of 2025. In the last 6 months, we've seen the darkening of the Russian web, the tightening of restrictions, and the looming specter of full internet control by the Kremlin. But now, in March, we've moved further ahead in the timeline than we anticipated. Censorship in Russia has escalated exponentially in the first few months of 2026, and there is a reason for it. But before we go on, I have a confession and a request. Tomorrow is my birthday, and there's one thing that would make me very, very happy: for you to become a member of the Kyiv Independent community. Behind our frontline reporting, newsletters, war crimes investigations, and shows just like this is a community of more than 28,000 people around the world who believe in the future of independent Ukrainian journalism and are taking action today. If you'd like to find out more, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is so appreciated. Now, cue the comments speculating about how old I'm turning. Since the start of this year, which we are less than 3 months into, 2 world leaders have been toppled by US-led coups: the president of Venezuela and the Ayatollah of Iran. Both spearheaded authoritarian regimes in their respective countries, and both were allies of Putin. These coups come just over a year after another contemporary of Putin, Bashar al-Assad, was ousted in the culmination of the Syrian civil war. They come a decade and a half after Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, a longtime friend of both the Soviet Union and Russia during his 40-plus-year dictatorship, was killed by rebel forces, and more than 2 decades after the public execution of Iraq's Saddam Hussein. As he's planned and waged his increasingly untenable and unpopular war in Ukraine, Putin has had no shortage of examples of fellow dictators losing their grip and paying the ultimate price. And it's clear that he intends to learn from their mistakes. In Iran in particular, we saw the role of social media in getting people onto the streets to protest, and broadcasting when authorities began massacring protesters. Or rather, we saw just enough to know that it was happening from the few bits of evidence and communication that eked through the near-total internet blackouts imposed by the Iranian government. Despite their best efforts to cut communication amongst the protesters, and between the protesters and the outside world, Iran failed to quash the rebellion before it grew, and it failed to keep the secret of its state-sanctioned mass murder from the outside world. An outside world that subsequently sent in military support to kill the Ayatollah. Although we can't know exactly what goes through Putin's mind, it's reasonable to assume that the spontaneous, violent unseating of Venezuela and Iran's leaders is unsettling to him, to say the least. And as researcher Nicholas Chikaija wrote in an op-ed for us earlier this week, when dictators like Putin believe their rule is threatened, they double down and escalate. However, they also make costly strategic mistakes, creating vulnerabilities that Ukraine and its partners can exploit. That brings us to the scene that I described in the introduction. Widespread internet outages that have even the bougie residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg buying up paper maps and analog pagers. On March 13th, the Kremlin announced that a so-called whitelist of certain government-approved websites will still be available online while the outages are ongoing. Now, the Kremlin isn't framing these intentionally induced internet outages as an anti-protest measure. Instead, they claim that the blackouts are a protective measure against Ukrainian drone attacks, which have indeed increased in frequency and range over time. But experts say that this logic doesn't hold up. When you cut civilian internet access during an air raid, it doesn't stop drones, which are usually pre-programmed or have some kind of independent internet connection. So if a Ukrainian drone flies to Moscow, it doesn't connect to the same mobile networks as Moscow residents' cell phones when it arrives. Taking internet access away from Russian civilians does not lower the likelihood of drone attacks. It does, however, greatly lower the likelihood of organized dissent among those civilians. The outages might be temporary, although, who knows? But the changes being made during them are designed to stick permanently. Anecdotally speaking, at several points in recent years, there's been a sense that Russia's connection to the global internet was ending in a significant way, and every single time a large chunk of Russians have found a workaround. I was working at Radio Free Europe back in 2022 when the Kremlin blocked Facebook, and I remember seeing the graph line on our engagement in Russia just drop to 0, which then prompted RFE to put out guidelines on how to use Tor browser to get around censors. There was also this day when every Russian content creator made a tearful goodbye post on Instagram before it was blocked in Russia, only for most to resume regular posting the next day after being introduced to the concept of a VPN. Even with increasing geopolitical isolation, Russians have stayed online. If there's a headline claiming that Barbie is banned from all streaming platforms in Russia, it's going to be followed by another about how a group of teenagers has torrented it and held an illegal screening in Moscow. And I'm in no way trying to diminish the severity of the censorship that Russians have faced thus far, because Putin and his regime have very successfully cut many people off from the outside world. But rather, I'm sharing these examples of previous clampdowns to illustrate the non-linear path from free speech to total government control. Restrictions have been introduced slowly and tightened over many years. Russians have complained and found workarounds, and the government has found ways to patch the holes and back and forth. But now, the Russian government is closer than ever to a level of internet control where Russians really can't access their Instagram accounts, and Russian teens really can't find out how Barbie ends. If before the digital Iron Curtain always had at least a few threads missing, the current crackdown has the potential to give it a steel-coated finish. Recent restrictions mark a departure from previous censorship tactics because the Kremlin is choosing not just what information their citizens can access, but how the entire internet in Russia is structured and interacted with. They're building a system where all control lies with the state. It's the state that has the power to share information, to monitor communication, and to switch things on and off where they want and when they want. They're creating a monopoly on information, where citizens don't have the choice to seek alternative sources. And again, I reiterate, these are not proven to be effective safety measures against Ukrainian drones. These are, historically, safety measures against domestic protests. And the history of protests in Putin's Russia mirrors its history of censorship. The anti-extremism laws and blatant corruption of the early to mid-2010s did inspire relatively large protests in major Russian cities, with tens of thousands gathering on Moscow's Bolotnaya Square to protest Putin's 2012 re-election, which was widely believed to be fraudulent. In the decade between that re-election and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin's tightening restrictions on free speech and free communication made demonstrations increasingly difficult. Not impossible, but risky at best and deadly at worst. There were just a handful of documented large demonstrations in Russia on and after February 24, 2022, and they were stamped out quickly as the reality of the war set in. There was a trend where Russians would post videos showing that simply holding up a sign with a vaguely anti-war message on Red Square would result in swift detainment by police. And at this point, organized protests are basically unheard of in Russia, and any one that seems to be gaining too much traction is likely state-sanctioned in some way. The monopoly on violence held by the Kremlin is one of the main reasons that Ukraine seeks to bring the war home to Russia, so to speak. To break down that illusion of stability that's given off by a society with no meaningful civic engagement. An ongoing combination of sanctions, economic depression, isolation, and looming mobilization could indeed bring Russians back out onto the streets in the 5th year of all-out war. And these new restrictions indicate that Putin is aware of that growing dissatisfaction. I also keep coming back to the fact that these outages are hitting Moscow and St. Petersburg. Like I'm always saying on this show, these cities, which have a combined population of nearly 20 million people, have escaped many of the negative effects of the war. They're far more developed than the rest of the country, their populations aren't the primary pools that Russia conscripts soldiers from, and their local economies have fared far better than those of the more remote provinces. The fact that even these cities are suffering from prolonged blackouts means that the Kremlin has reached a new stage of not caring about popularity among its most privileged citizens. Putin seems ready to accept public dissatisfaction and richly deserved accusations of dictatorship in return for total control over the Russian internet. And barring some kind of intervention, he's going to be successful. There have even been reports of Russians discussing relocation to Belarus in response to the outages. And yes, Belarus is objectively also a dictatorship, and the fact that Russians are even considering moving there for a better quality of life says a lot about the track that Putin's Russia is currently on. But there's one important thing to note before we end. These restrictions handed down from the Kremlin don't just affect the people living within the borders of the Russian Federation as they were drawn in 1991. These measures also affect everyone living in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine and their loved ones on the outside. We spoke with a woman whose parents remain in occupied territory, who asked that we keep her identity anonymous for safety reasons. So, just the basic facts, what method do you use to contact your family, and how has it gotten more difficult over time?
Currently, we communicate with my parents using an alternative messenger that was recommended to me by my acquaintances, who also communicate with their parents in the occupied territories. It's called emo. We also try to communicate via Telegram. We exchange messages, but there is still a problem with video calls. The connection is unstable, which is why we have this problem. On March 20th, the connection was completely lost. We couldn't call either on Telegram or WhatsApp. My mother was very worried because this is the only opportunity for us to see each other because I am living abroad. It was very difficult and emotional to process. They are limited in their ability to perceive external information, to read any independent sources, so they themselves are very worried.
And what are the main worries for the future in this regard?
I feel very sad for my parents for the fact that they are left without the opportunity to even communicate with their family. Now, my mother told me that they know about the upcoming restriction of even those alternative messengers that we use now. She says the news is out, that people at work are talking about it, that they are also concerned and worried as they are trying to find alternative ways to communicate. My mom's colleague installed some proxy servers to try to communicate via Telegram. But we will look for alternative options for communication. For an extreme scenario, we exchanged email addresses to communicate just by email. Some of my acquaintances are now restoring their accounts on Russian websites vKontakte and Odnoklasniki via VPN to stay in touch with their families. Most of us have grandparents in occupied territories. It's very difficult for them to use these new technologies to connect via VPN and be able to at least just call, hear the voice of their loved ones. These are the options we have. But it is actually very sad. I feel very sad for my parents that they are forced to live in such conditions and are unable to have such simple, important things. For people there, especially the elderly, it's very difficult to have their own opinion. Because they have been living for many years under the influence of this propaganda, under the influence of these narratives. They don't have access to objective information and have no opportunity to read truly independent sources beyond what they are told on television. It's very difficult. Like many of my friends, I had a lot of conflicts with my family because they couldn't accept the truth that we know, because for them the truth is, unfortunately, completely different.
On the overall topic of Russia's internet censorship, I don't have a strong call to action to leave you with. It's a long game that won't be interrupted at this point by anything other than a full overthrow of the Russian government. But I do ask that you keep this final point in mind. To say that Ukraine should give up territory for the sake of temporary peace is to say that all of the people living in that territory deserve to live in a totalitarian state that's becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. State censorship and surveillance has and will continue to be most acutely trained on the regions that Moscow is working to subsume ideologically, the places where opposition to Moscow is strongest and hope for independence from it survives. Like I said, the only way out of this mess is to destroy the system that has spawned it. And if this has been a year for toppling dictators in aid of their constituents' dreams of democracy, then please let Putin distinguish himself as the next candidate.
This week's question is from our community member Joey. The question is, how will censorship impact Ukraine's foothold inside Russia? I can see a scenario where it would be harder to contact people inside Russia for sabotage purposes. So, as I understand it, by the censorship, Jolie means Russia's increasing efforts to restrict access to certain websites and block social media and messaging apps services, such like Facebook, WhatsApp, and more recently, Telegram. This is a real issue as Russia is trying to have more control over information in general. Analysts from the Center of National Resistance of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces told the Kyiv Independent that as for now, access blocking is not that widespread. But this could change after the 1st of April, and such risks exist given the statements by Russian authorities about a possible complete blockade. The analyst also added that the main risk after blocking Telegram is the complication of delivering news to people in the Russian-occupied territories and providing them with objective information, first of all. They will become more vulnerable to Russian propaganda, which will increase isolation and manipulation. But regarding contacting people for sabotage activities, this type of communication will not be affected, as those involved have long moved to more secure channels and have a high level of training and awareness. So Telegram is not the main tool used for sabotage activities.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.